In 1803, the poet William Wordsworth was with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and they were visiting Coralin, a waterfall in Scotland, when they met a lady and a gentleman, and the gentleman observed that it was a majestic waterfall. Coleridge was very pleased with that because he'd been thinking about words like that, like majestic, like grand and sublime, been thinking through exactly what they meant, and he very much agreed that the waterfall was indeed majestic. However, the lady at that point declared that it was also sublime and beautiful, which Coleridge was less than impressed about by the sound of it, and pretty much gave up on the conversation. So that little vignette actually throws up some quite interesting questions about the language of landscape appreciation and the ways in which apparently quite similar words, certainly to someone as unpoetic as I am, quite similar words can be used in very different ways to describe landscapes. And landscapes are maybe quite similar, maybe quite different. So we've been thinking a little bit about how to go about exploring these sorts of questions and these sorts of themes. But my background is not at all in literary studies. I'm actually a geographer by training, and my main interest is in a technology called geographical information systems, which actually, I was going to say certainly used to be very much a quantitative technology. I got involved in it some years ago. Thanks for reminding me about writing a book in 2003. That seemed like a very long time ago now. When I got involved in it, it was very much through things like census data and like quantitative mortality data, and using it to explore these sorts of things, primarily in the 19th century. But as time's come on more recently, become very interested in how we can use it to explore textual sources and also to explore qualitative concepts like the ways that different adjectives can be used to describe different landscapes or describe landscapes in different ways. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, picking up particularly on these three words that Coleridge was involved in that little incident over, majestic, sublime and beautiful. So 2 or 3 years ago, under European Research Council funding, we built a corpus of Lake District writing, which consists of 80 texts written from 1622 to 1900. So from one of the earliest texts to about as recent as we can get away with before we start worrying about copyright problems. It's got about 1.5 million words in there, so it's not an enormous corpus, but it's quite large. It includes quite a wide variety of texts, from the fairly obvious, well-known writers like the ones that are up there at the moment, through to some much more obscure texts as well. They've all been digitized, originally in a fairly simple type of XML, which looks like that. Basically, it's just a little bit of extra coding put in there, just to show things like paragraph breaks and page breaks and things like that, maybe where images are. But because I'm a geographer, what really interests me is place names and how we can extract place names automatically and how we can then go around mapping where the text is referring to from there. So we run this through a geoparser, which is a bit of software which is intended to automatically identify place names and to allocate it to coordinates. So once we've done it, the text looks like that, which looks considerably less interesting and less understandable than it did before. But you'll see that somewhere in all this, we've not only identified place names, but we've also added coordinates to them, laps and longs to them. What that means is that we can then take this text and start to map it, or even take the entire corpus and start to map it. If we map the whole corpus for the area around the Lake District, it looks like that. We have almost 40,000 place names in the corpus as a whole, most of which are in and around the Lake District. And if we map it like that, you end up with a map with an awful lot of spots on it that doesn't mean an awful lot. But once we've got to that point, I'm kind of back into my comfort area. I know what I'm doing with this sort of stuff. This is point pattern analysis in the jargon that I was originally educated in. And we can start to simplify that and make it much more understandable using a variety of spatial analysis techniques. So a simple one's called density smoothing, which basically tries to identify where there are a lot of points and compare that with where there are very few points. So what that tells us is that within the corpus as a whole, the dark greens are the areas that people are talking about the most, and perhaps they're not all that surprising. So you've got areas like Keswick and down into Derwentwater and Borrowdale from there. You've got the kind of Thirlmere, Helvellyn area, Grasmere, Ambleside, Langdale, Windermere, Kendal, Ullswater, Penrith, places like that really standing out. Perhaps more surprisingly, you've got large areas of what today is within the Lake District National Park, which are barely talked about at all, even though we've got a fairly large collection of writing that is generating that map. So from there, what we've done is we've started a text, we've geoparsed it, and then we've turned it into a relatively understandable bit of mapping. But we're not just interested in where a corpus is talking about, we're also interested, or perhaps more interested, in what it's saying about those places. And if we're interested in that, the concept that we've then got to explore is one that we're calling place name collocations. It's really quite a simple idea to give some proxy about what places are being described by what words. Basically, all we're doing with this is if a place name occurs within 10 words of a search term that we're interested in, we're assuming that the place name is relevant to that search term. So, as an example here on Sublime, the mighty Helvellyn, how sublime in elevation. We're assuming that Sublime and Helvellyn are linked in some way, are being associated with each other by the writer, and reading that, you can be fairly confident that's right. Similarly, the scenery about Buttermere is truly sublime and august. Again, Sublime and Buttermere coming together as a place name collocation. The one at the bottom is slightly more complicated, because in this one, Sublime's actually being associated with two places. So we've got two place name collocations, one with Blackcomb and one with Scafell. But because of that 10-word cut-off, that somewhat arbitrary 10-word cut-off, it's actually missing some of the other places that are also being associated with Sublime on that. Coniston Old Man, Helvellyn, Fairfield, Hillbell all fall outside that window, so we're actually going to miss them. But nevertheless, it gives us a way into understanding the association between a particular search term, in this case Sublime, and the places that are being associated with it. So if we then move on back to our three words that Coleridge was interested in, beautiful, majestic, sublime, you can see that beautiful is used far more than any of the other two. Majestic's used the least. But actually, majestic is more commonly associated with place. Almost half of the occurrences of majestic collocate with a place name, within 10 words of a place name. Beautiful, slightly less so, and sublime's actually the least associated with place of the three words. We can then, though, go one stage further and actually map these place name collocations. So this map is a map of where the corpus describes as beautiful, or be slightly more precise about it, which place names collocate with beautiful. Perhaps not an entirely surprising pattern. We've got a lot around Keswick and Derwentwater. We've got a lot around Grasmere and Ambleside. We've got Windermere down here, maybe some evidence along Ullswater as well. What you might criticise that for, or certainly from my background in spatial analysis, what I'd criticise it for, is we'd already established that there was quite a strong geography associated with Lake District writing in that corpus. So how do you know that that isn't simply just reflecting that underlying geography that I talked about a minute or two ago? Well, we can use a spatial analysis technique which strangely actually originated over here when people were investigating whether cancers were clustering around Sellafield, to explore exactly that. Are you getting more of a particular phenomenon, in this case place name collocates with beautiful, than you'd expect from a background geography, in this case the overall namings of places within the corpus. So what this map is doing on the right is showing where we're getting more occurrences of beautiful than we'd expect given that background geography, and also fewer occurrences than we'd expect given that background geography. So we find more in and around Derwentwater and up into Bathenswaite. We find more, even though it's a popular place, that Grasmere in particular is strongly associated with beautiful. But a place that isn't visited very much, the southern Lake District around Cartmel and Ulverston and places like that, is also emerging as being talked about more frequently as beautiful than perhaps we'd expect, given it's not visited, or at least not named all that much within the corpus. The western fells over here, Scafell and the area around that, actually emerge as a cold spot. They're described as beautiful less often than we'd expect. Majestic, quite a different pattern, very heavily concentrated on two places, Skiddaw, precisely, and the Duddon Valley down here as well. And both of those come across as hotspots on the Kulldorff scan statistic map as well. Sublime, different pattern again. On this map over here, we've got the Derwentwater area coming across quite strongly, but we've also got Coniston over here, and we've got the Western Fells over here. And it's the Western Fells in particular that stand out. It's an area which isn't described all that much in the corpus, but it does stand out as being described as sublime far more than we'd expect when we put that kind of spatial analysis technique over it. So how do those compare? Can we bring all those three together? This map's the first attempt to do it, and what this really shows, it's a slightly complicated map, so I'll just talk through quite quickly. What it really shows is actually there are very different geographies between the three search terms. There is a certain amount of overlap shown in this kind of pinky purple colour between beautiful and sublime. They overlap quite a lot around Keswick and Derwentwater. They overlap again around Windermere. There's a small amount of overlap between beautiful and majestic at Skiddaw, and really nowhere else, it is just Skiddaw. But apart from that, the words are actually associated with really quite different landscapes. And again, if we use the kind of hotspot, cold spot analysis, we also see patterns which basically don't overlap at all. We've got beautiful kind of Bath and Thwaite Derwentwater area, Grasmere and in the Southern Lakes. We've got majestic, in and around Skiddaw and Blencathra up here and the Duddon down here, and we've got sublime over in the Western Fells, but there's almost no overlap between these. So actually Coleridge is right, the words are being used in very, very different ways to describe landscapes. But a key point about this sort of analysis is that these maps are not really answers to questions at all. These maps in themselves are probably questions rather much more than their answers, because they actually then throw back, they kind of throw a question to you. Why is this pattern as it is, or why are these patterns as it is? And to answer these patterns, we move back into more traditional literary studies forms of analysis, if you like, which typically involve actually reading the texts. But what the maps do is point you to where within the text perhaps you might want to read. So let's start with majestic, because it really does have a very precise pattern to it. Skiddaw is overwhelmingly described as majestic. It's the place which really does come across very strongly. And when you look through it, it does seem that it's always been described as majestic. Guidebooks particularly refer to it as majestic, but it comes across as that occurring an awful lot. Blencathra only seems to sneak in as majestic as a result of its proximity to Skiddaw, and also perhaps as a slight artifact of the way we're measuring it, in that because Blencathra is often referred to as Blencathra or Saddleback, that doubles the number of times it appears somewhat artificially. So when you get phrases like this, majestic Skiddaw with Blencathra and Saddleback on its right, really it's only Skiddaw that's majestic, but Blencathra, because of its proximity, both geographically and textually, is sneaking in there. So I think we can kind of discard that. The Duddon's quite interesting, though. It gives a real contrast to Skiddaw in that the Duddon's not described as majestic until Wordsworth's 1820 River Duddon sonnets, where he uses the phrase, "Now expands majestic Duddon over smooth flat sands." From there, subsequent to that, in 5 different Victorian texts, this exact quote appears. So once Wordsworth has described the Duddon Valley as majestic, then it becomes acceptable, indeed it becomes quite common to describe the Duddon as majestic. And that's what drives the Duddon, I think it's fair to say, what drives the Duddon as being described as majestic. Once Wordsworth called it that, other people start to call it that. But until that point, the Duddon wasn't associated with majestic at all. Sublime's actually used in a very different way to majestic. Majestic tends to be a single place, be it a valley or a mountain, are majestic. Sublime, it tends to be landscapes that are sublime, in particular the Western Fells. So this is quite a typical phrase that's used for sublime. That sublime group of mountains, Yew Barrow, Pillar, Great Gable, Kirkfell, Lingmel and Scafell, which, because of that slightly arbitrary 10-word definition that we're using, actually underestimates how much those Western Fells are regarded as sublime, because a couple of them at the end drop off. And then Baines a little bit earlier is doing pretty much the same thing. The Western Mountains of Red Pike, High Stile and High Crag rise precipitously to a sublime elevation. So again, you're getting this idea of a broad landscape of multiple mountain peaks, and that's the way that sublime is being used. Originally, that's just the Western Fells, but actually later in the period, particularly after Mackay in 1846, the Coniston Fells start to be described in the same way. Although it doesn't come across on the mapping, the lakes also are sublime, and it's in much the same way as well. One of the early texts, so we've got Cumberland in 1776, says, "Our own domestic lakes of Ullswater, Keswick and Windermere exhibits scenes in so sublime a style." So again, it's that idea of a multiple list of major place names is again reproduced in later guidebooks like Robinson's, Cook's, Baines, Lee, and so on and so forth. So you getting this idea of sublime being multiple places linked together, large views of large landscapes typically, in a way that majestic is not. Majestic is one place in particular. Beautiful is a bit more complicated, perhaps because it's such a generic word. It hasn't got anything like as precise a meaning. That Southern Lakes cluster that emerges as a hotspot is actually driven by a chap called Waugh in 1860 who talked about over the sands to the lakes, where he perambulates around that southern part of the Lake District, which isn't all that visited then, and it still isn't today. And talks about, he throws the word beautiful about quite liberally as he's doing it or describing his journey. And he then reproduces pretty much the same text in another book a year later, which is also in the corpus, which perhaps misleadingly, perhaps not, drives that hotspot. And I think if you took those texts out, we'd probably lose that pattern. Apart from that, though, the word is used by a very wide variety of uses, wide variety of authors, a wide variety of genres. But it does seem that beautiful is very much associated with actually much lower landscapes than the other words, perhaps, and in particular, the kind of obvious touristic hotspots, particularly Keswick and the Grasmere, Ambleside area as well. The word beautiful tends to be strongly associated with those. So to sum that up then, in the first instance, three perhaps quite similar words, but through using this mapping technology, this superficially very quantitative technology, we're able to identify that there are actually very contrasting ways in which these words are used, and indeed in the evolution of the ways these words are used to describe different landscapes. So majestic is typically used to describe one place, a mountain and a valley in particular, small number of specific features. Sublime, on the other hand, tends to be used for mountain ranges, particularly in the Western Fells, but also can be used as lakes, but it's a much more general, broad landscape kind of idea. Whereas beautiful is a much more general word, but tends to be more associated with low landscapes and popular landscapes, I think it's true to say. Overall, though, the wider implications of this is that what is actually, or what certainly traditionally was a very quantitative technology used for statistical analysis of geographical patterns, I think we can show that that can be used to summarize geographies within text and to get at much more to shed new light on much more complicated and qualitative impressions like emotional response to landscape. So, but not, there's a concept of distant reading that's been used quite a lot, and I do have quite a lot of sympathy with the idea, but actually I think with GIS you can go beyond the kind of crude overall summaries of what's being said, but actually then use that to reflect back on the text and then focus in on particular things to see how particular places have become associated with a particular theme, and how those have changed over time. So there's a need in doing this sort of analysis to balance the kind of crude, broad brush impressions that technology is very good at driving with the much more detailed and nuanced readings that you still need people to do. If you want to know any more about that, a couple of websites up there on projects that I'm currently associated with. And if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about how we can use this sort of mapping technologies in the humanities, we're having a workshop in Lancaster, a free workshop in Lancaster, sponsored by the Leverhulme Trust, on Wednesday the 14th of September. And if you want to know anything more about it, I think it's that URL there which will point you in that direction. Thank you very much.